Julian Vance did not view himself as a monster. He considered himself an architect of peace. To Julian, the world was grotesquely misaligned. As a senior urban restoration specialist for the city, he spent his days observing how poor design invited chaos. Asymmetric doorways bred anxiety. Narrow, crooked corridors cultivated violence. But worst of all was the human frame. The way people walked, slouched, and collapsed into asymmetric grief was a design flaw that pained him physically. The city's historic district was his drafting table. His basement workshop, hidden beneath a 19th century brownstone, was his sanctuary. Tonight, his canvas was Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was a 52-year-old accountant whose life was defined by slouched shoulders, a limp in his right knee, and a permanent, lopsided frown born of chronic stress. Julian had observed him for 4 months, meticulously mapping Arthur's daily route. He had noted how Arthur's spine bent under the weight of his briefcase, how his left collarbone sat 3 centimeters lower than his right. It was an unacceptable structural error. When Arthur awoke, he found himself stripped to his waist and secured to an adjustable steel examination table. The room was sterile, smelling faintly of lavender and surgical-grade antiseptic. Above him hung 3 warm LED spotlights, casting sharp, clear shadows across the stone floor. "Please," Arthur rasped, his voice trembling violently. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. I have money. Take my wallet." Julian sat at a heavy wooden desk nearby, adjusting a pair of brass calipers. He wore a crisp, tailored linen suit with a transparent PVC apron strapped cleanly over it. He turned slowly, his pale blue eyes serene and entirely devoid of malice. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice a calm, resonant baritone that echoed softly in the vaulted chamber. "Money cannot mend the structural tragedy you inhabit. Look at yourself." Julian clicked a remote control. A large wall-mounted monitor flared to life, displaying high-resolution infrared scans of Arthur's body. "Your posture is an offense to basic geometry," Julian continued softly, standing up and walking toward the table with measured steps. "Your spine curves 6 degrees to the left. Your shoulders are uneven. You carry your misery in your bone structure. You are in constant, silent pain, aren't you?" I just want to go home," Arthur wept, tears smearing across his cheeks. "You are home," Julian whispered, placing a cool, gloved hand gently on Arthur's forehead. "I'm going to fix you. I'm going to grant you absolute symmetrical mercy." The transformation began not with violence, but with terrifying precision. Julian had spent years studying orthopedic surgery and architectural mechanics. To him, flesh was merely living marble, soft, forgiving, but desperately in need of a straight line. He wheeled a stainless steel cart to the side of the table. On it sat custom-forged braces, titanium pins, and surgical scalpels aligned meticulously by size. The human mind suffers because the body is asymmetrical, Julian explained as he marked Arthur's collarbones with a blue surgical marker. He worked with the delicate care of a restorer touching an ancient fresco. "Nature is sloppy, Arthur. I am simply completing what biology failed to finish." Arthur screamed as the first local anesthetic was injected into his nerve clusters. The drug paralyzed his motor functions while keeping his mind crystal clear. He could feel the cold metal, the tug of leather straps, and the inescapable weight of Julian's obsessive gaze. For hours, Julian worked in absolute silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the air purifier and the classical notes of Bach playing softly in the background. He made 2 precise incisions along the collarbones, inserting microscopic titanium shims to lift Arthur's left shoulder until it sat at a perfect 90-degree angle to his spine. Whenever Arthur whimpered, Julian paused, dabbing the sweat from Arthur's brow with a damp silk cloth. "Breathe, Arthur," Julian coaxed gently, his tone resembling a devoted physician rather than a captor. "Perfection requires alignment. You must endure the blueprint before you can enjoy the structure." Around midnight, Julian reached the most crucial phase, the facial structure. Human emotion was inherently lopsided. Smirks, winks, and scowls dragged the delicate muscles of the face out of alignment over time. Julian placed a custom-built stainless steel frame around Arthur's head. Micro-tension wires were attached to the corners of Arthur's mouth and eyebrows, pulling them into a state of absolute mathematical neutrality. Arthur's eyes darted frantically, flooded with terror. He wanted to scream, to beg, to thrash, but the tension wires held his jaw and lips in an unyielding, tranquil posture. He was trapped inside a rigid cage of flesh and steel. Julian stepped back, wiping his hands on a pristine cloth. He lowered a large mirror from the ceiling, angling it directly above Arthur's face. "Look," Julian whispered, his eyes gleaming with genuine reverence. "Look at what we have achieved." Arthur looked up into the mirror. The man staring back was unrecognizable. His shoulders were squared with mathematical perfection. His neck sat straight. His facial expressions were gone, replaced by an eerie, perfectly balanced calm. His body no longer looked human. It looked like a statue carved by a manic coldness. "You see," Julian murmured, leaning down close to Arthur's ear, "the noise in your mind, it has stopped, hasn't it? There is no fear in Symmetry." By 4 in the morning, the operation was complete. Julian removed the temporary steel braces from Arthur's limbs, replacing them with subtle, internal carbon fiber splints hidden beneath the skin. Arthur's body was now permanently locked into flawless posture. He could walk, but only with a rigid, dignified grace. He could breathe, but his facial muscles could never warp into an expression of panic or sorrow ever again. Julian gently dressed Arthur in a bespoke, tailored dark suit, every seam aligned perfectly with the newly constructed lines of Arthur's body. "You are free to go, Arthur," Julian said, offering a hand to help him stand. Arthur slowly swung his legs over the side of the table. His body felt lighter, eerily centered, yet utterly alien. He opened his mouth to speak, but his lips could only form a clean, neutral line. The terror was still screaming inside his mind, yet his physical form refused to express it. "Why?" Arthur managed to utter, the sound coming out flat, smooth, and stripped of all emotional inflection. "Because the city needs monuments of peace," Julian replied, opening the heavy wooden door that led up to a secluded alleyway. "Go back to your life. Walk through the crowded streets. Show them what it means to be free from chaos." Arthur stumbled out into the cool night air. The alley was dark, moist with morning fog. He stood under the golden glow of a street lamp, his arms hanging perfectly parallel to his torso, his head held at a flawless right angle. He tried to cry, but his tear ducts had been redirected. His facial muscles remained unbothered, frozen in serene perfection. He walked down the pavement, his steps echoing in a rhythmic, metronomic beat. Passers-by would see a man of extraordinary poise and calm, man who seemed completely at peace with the world. None of them would ever know that inside that perfectly constructed shell, a soul was screaming in endless horror. Back in his sanctuary, Julian sat at his wooden desk. He took out a fresh leather journal, opened it to a clean white page, and uncapped his fountain pen. He drew a straight, dark line down the middle of the page. Beneath it, he wrote Arthur's name in precise calligraphy, followed by a small green checkmark. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, took a slow sip of his tea, and looked at the blueprint resting on his desk. It was a detailed map of the city's mayor, a man known for his chaotic gestures and nervous tics. Julian smiled, his face a portrait of quiet, symmetrical contentment. "So much work left to do," he whispered to the empty room. "So many lives left to heal." To the rest of the world, sound was merely vibration. To Samuel Vance, sound was color, texture, and geometry. Samuel suffered from an extreme, hyperspecific form of synesthesia. A violin's note materialized in his mind as a streak of crimson silk. A child's laughter bloomed like a bouquet of soft yellow pastel. But no sound held greater artistic beauty to Samuel than the precise, raw frequency of human terror. Panic was not a simple, ugly noise. It was a rich, complex shade of deep violet, interwoven with jagged threads of cobalt blue. For 3 years, Samuel worked from an abandoned, underground recording studio nestled beneath the city's arts district. Soundproofed with thick acoustic foam and lined with vintage, reel-to-reel tape recorders, his sanctuary was designed to capture audio with microscopic clarity. Tonight, he was preparing his grandest composition. He called it the Tonalist's Last Canvas. His subject sat securely bound in a heavy wooden chair at the center of the live room. Her name was Clara Finch, a 28-year-old classical cellist. Samuel had selected her not out of malice, but because of her voice. Her vocal cords possessed a pitch-perfect resonance that he knew would yield the most breathtaking shades of dark violet when subjected to the proper psychological stimuli. Clara awoke slowly, her vision adjusting to the dim amber glow of the studio's incandescent bulbs. A high-end condenser microphone hung suspended mere inches from her lips. Behind a thick double-pane glass window sat Samuel, wearing a charcoal wool suit and vintage studio headphones. "Please," Clara gasped, her voice trembling slightly. "Where am I? Why are you doing this?" Samuel clicked a button on his mixing console. His voice drifted through the studio monitors. Soft, polite, and entirely devoid of malice. "Good evening, Clara," Samuel said gently. "Please do not strain your vocal cords unnecessarily. We have a long night ahead, and I need your pitch to remain pure. What do you want from me?" She sobbed, pulling against the leather restraints on her wrists. Through his headphones, Samuel listened intently. He closed his eyes. The tremor in her voice translated into a faint, pale lavender swirl in his mind. Not deep enough, he thought, adjusting a dial on his equalizer. She is still only confused. The true color has not yet bloomed. Samuel understood that physical pain produced crude, harsh noises, sharp, unrefined splashes of neon red that lacked artistic depth. True terror, however, was a psychological art form. It required patience, manipulation, and atmosphere. Over the next 4 hours, Samuel conducted his silent, terrifying orchestra. He did not touch Clara. Instead, he manipulated the auditory environment of the room. Through the high-fidelity speakers surrounding her, he played subtle, binaural infrasound, frequencies so low the human ear could not consciously hear them, but which triggered an immediate, instinctual sense of dread in the human brain. Next came the localized sounds, the soft, wet sound of footsteps creeping up behind her chair, the rasping breath of someone whispering directly into her ear, and the sudden, deafening snap of a wooden bone echoing from the dark corners of the room. "He's behind you." "Clara," Samuel's voice whispered through the comms, cold and deliberate. "Don't turn around." Clara screamed. It was a sharp, piercing sound that vibrated through the studio. In Samuel's mind, the pale lavender shattered into a magnificent burst of deep indigo, radiating outwards like ink dropping into clear water. He recorded every decibel, his fingers flying across the mixing board, adjusting levels, compressing frequencies, and layering her cries over a slow, haunting ambient synth pad. "Magnificent," Samuel whispered to himself, his eyes wide with genuine artistic reverence. The timbre, the resonance, it is utterly breathtaking. By midnight, Clara was hyperventilating. Her chest heaved. Her eyes darted frantically across the empty, shadowed studio, and her breathing became a rapid, jagged rhythm. "Why won't you just kill me?" Clara shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of utter despair. "Just end it." Samuel paused. He leaned forward toward the glass, his expression filled with profound sympathy. "Kill you?" Samuel echoed softly through the microphone. "Clara, death is merely silence. Silence has no color. I am not trying to end your life. I am trying to immortalize your soul." He activated the final audio track, a loop of Clara's own recorded voice from earlier in the evening, pitched down 2 octaves and reversed, so it sounded as though a sinister entity was mimicking her deepest secrets from within. The walls. Clara collapsed inward, her psychological resistance completely crumbling. She let out a long, sustained, low-pitched wail of absolute hopeless terror, a sound so pure, so stripped of human ego, that it echoed perfectly through the studio. In Samuel's mind, the canvas was finally complete, a vast, breathtaking expanse of deep, shimmering violet surrounded by razor-thin lines of obsidian black. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. By 4 a.m, the recording session was finished. The studio fell into total, heavy silence. Clara sat slumped in the chair, her head hanging low, her breathing slow and shallow. She was physically unharmed, but her spirit was entirely spent, her mind numb from hours of relentless psychological torment. Samuel pushed open the heavy acoustic door and walked into the live room. He carried a small glass of water and a warm blanket. He draped the blanket gently over Clara's shivering shoulders and placed the glass near her hand. "You were extraordinary, Clara," Samuel said softly, kneeling beside her chair. "Fewer than 1 in a million people possess a voice capable of producing such exquisite color." Clara slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were hollow, completely drained of fire or defiance. When she opened her mouth to speak, no sound came out. The trauma had locked her vocal cords in a state of psychogenic aphonia. She was completely mute. "Do not worry," Samuel whispered, offering her a faint, respectful smile. "Your voice is not gone. It has simply been moved to a safer place." Samuel stood up, unbuckled her leather restraints, and stepped back to allow her to stand. Clara stumbled toward the heavy steel exit door, not looking back, stepping out into the cold, foggy morning air of the city streets. She would return to her life, to her apartment, and to her music. But she would never play the cello again, nor would she ever speak another word. Her voice had been permanently harvested. Back behind his mixing console, Samuel sat in his leather chair. He took out a thick vinyl master disc, carefully placed it onto a high-end turntable, and lowered the ruby needle into the groove. He pulled his studio headphones over his ears and pressed play as the haunting, magnificent composition played, a symphony woven entirely from Clara's terror. Samuel closed his eyes. The room vanished around him, replaced by a towering, magnificent canvas of deep violet light that illuminated his dark studio. He opened his leather journal, wrote Clara's name down on a blank page, and placed a delicate musical note beside it. Below her name, he wrote the title of his next track, Movement 3, The Architect's Whisper. Samuel adjusted his headphones, looked at the photo of a young opera singer taped to his desk, and smiled. "The album is coming along beautifully," he whispered into the dark. To lose one's path in life is a tragedy, but to lose one's name is an absolute erasure. In the quiet, cobblestone alleyways of an old European quarter stood a narrow 3-story brownstone. Its ground floor was ostensibly a bookbindery, smelling faintly of aged leather, pressed parchment, and wood ash. But beneath the shop lay an expansive, bone-chilling archive known only to its sole archivist, Dr. Alistair Finch. Alistair was a man of impeccably refined taste, dressed always in a tailored charcoal suit with silver cufflinks. His demeanor was perpetually soft-spoken and polite, yet Alistair harbored an obsession far darker than rare manuscripts. He believed that a human being's identity was not an abstract concept, but a tangible, physical weight anchorable to spoken syllables, their name. And when a person was subjected to complete isolation and meticulous psychological deconstruction, their name could be surgically extracted, leaving behind a blank, obedient vessel. In the center of his subterranean archive sat a heavy oak desk, lit by a single brass banker's lamp. Lined along the stone walls were hundreds of brass-bound leather ledgers. Each book was labeled not with numbers, but with a pristine copper plate, calligraphy of a human name. Names belonging to people who had vanished without a trace over the past decade. Tonight, Alistair was preparing the final volume of his collection. Bound securely to an iron-framed armchair across from Alistair's desk was Gabriel Ross, a 32-year-old investigative journalist who had spent 6 months trailing the city's unresolved missing persons cases. Gabriel had come too close to the truth, and now he was the subject of Alistair's grandest experiment. Gabriel stirred, his vision clearing as the effects of the sedative wore off. His breath hitched in his throat. Leather straps secured his wrists and ankles, and a thin silver collar rested snugly against his throat, fitted with tiny acoustic sensors that hummed quietly. "Good evening, Gabriel," Alistair said gently, placing a cup of steaming black tea on the corner of his desk. "I trust the head tremor has passed?" The compound can be somewhat unforgiving upon awakening. "Alistair," Gabriel gasped, his voice raspy, his chest heaving. "What is this place? Let me go. My team knows I came to your shop." Alistair offered a mild, almost pitying smile as he dipped a fountain pen into a well of deep indigo ink. "They know you went to buy an antique atlas." "Gabriel," Alistair corrected softly, "nothing more. But please, save your breath. Words are remarkably precious things. especially the ones we are about to address. The method Alistair employed was not crude violence. Pain, he believed, only anchored a person closer to their survival instincts, and thus, closer to their identity. Instead, Alistair utilized the agonizing process of sensory deprivations, hypnotic repetition, and psychological disorientation. Over the next 12 hours, Alistair conducted a precise interrogation designed to unravel the thread of Gabriel's memory. A heavy pendulum swung silently behind Alistair, illuminated by a single pin spotlight. Through high-fidelity acoustic panels mounted around the room, Alistair played a continuous, subtle recording of overlapping, whispered voices, hundreds of strangers reciting random, meaningless names in a monotonous cadence. "We begin with the anchor," Alistair said politely, opening a fresh ledger of handmade cream paper. "Tell me, young man, who are you?" "I am Gabriel Ross," he answered firmly, gripping the armrest. "Born in Chicago. Journalist for the Metropolitan Gazette. My name is Gabriel." Alistair nodded, jotting down the response with a light scratch of his nib. "A sturdy start," Alistair murmured. "Now, repeat it 50 times, but with every repetition, omit a letter." Whenever Gabriel resisted, Alistair did not raise his voice. He simply pressed a button on his console, flooding the room with a disorienting, low-frequency hum that disrupted Gabriel's spatial awareness, making the room feel as though it were tilting into a bottomless void. Hours bled into one another. The dim underground room offered no sunrise, no passage of time, only the rhythmic tick-tock of the pendulum and Alistair's calm, measured voice. "Who are you?" Alistair asked again at 2 a.m. "Gabriel," the young man whispered, his eyes bloodshot, staring blankly into the shadows. His mind felt heavy, like wet paper tearing apart under its own weight. "Who was the boy who broke his arm climbing the oak tree in summer?" Alistair inquired softly, reading from a stolen childhood diary he had retrieved from Gabriel's apartment. "Was that Gabriel, or was that merely a story you read once?" It was me," Gabriel stammered, confusion clouding his gaze. "I think I fell." "Are you certain?" Alistair pressed gently, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with intense intellectual fervor. "Or did Gabriel die in that tree, and you simply stole his memory? Think carefully. If you are Gabriel, why does the name sound so foreign to your tongue now?" Gabriel opened his mouth, but the word caught in his throat. He repeated it internally, Gabriel, 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 until the syllables lost all meaning, dissolving into a meaningless string of vocal noises. "I don't," Gabriel wept quietly, tears carving clean lines through the dust on his cheeks. "Why can't I hold on to it?" "Because it was never truly yours," Alistair murmured softly, his tone filled with profound reverence. "It was merely a label placed upon you by others. Let it go, my boy. Yield the weight of it to the ledger." By the 5th hour of morning, the psychological erosion was absolute. The room was deathly quiet, save for the slow, ragged breathing of the man in the chair. Gabriel's posture had completely relaxed, his muscles devoid of tension, his eyes wide and hollow as he stared at the blank stone wall before him. The fight was gone. The narrative of his life, his childhood memories, his career, his loves, and his fears had been systematically unraveled, thread by thread. Alistair stood up from his desk, smoothed his jacket, and walked over to the chair. He leaned down, his face inches from the young man's ear. "One final time for the record," Alistair whispered politely. "What is your name?" The man in the chair blinked slowly. He looked at Alistair, then at the heavy brass-bound ledger resting open on the oak desk. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. He searched the dark corners of his mind for the word Gabriel, but found only empty, quiet gray mist. "I do not have one," the man whispered, his voice entirely flat, devoid of emotion, fear, or identity. Alistair closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, savoring the absolute stillness of the moment. "Magnificent," Alistair breathed. He reached into his pocket, drew a small silver scalpel, and made a tiny, precise nick on the man's fingertip. Alistair pressed the finger against the final page of the ledger, leaving a neat, crimson thumbprint beneath the beautifully calligraphed title, Gabriel Ross. Alistair then unbuckled the leather straps. The man did not run. He did not scream. He simply remained seated, hands resting quietly in his lap, waiting for instructions like a newly forged mannequin. "You may stand," Alistair instructed gently. The nameless man stood up, moving with a fluid, vacant grace. Alistair walked him to the back door of the basement, which opened into a dark, foggy side alley leading out to the sleeping city. He placed a warm coat over the man's shoulders and slid a small stack of cash into his pocket. "Go out into the world," Alistair said with a polite, fatherly nod. "You are free of the burden of self. You are no one." The man stepped out into the damp morning fog, wandering down the empty street without a past, a destination, or an identity. He would wander the world as an anonymous ghost, never remembering who he had been. Back inside his archive, Dr. Alistair Finch carefully closed the leather ledger with a heavy, satisfying thud. He placed it on the top shelf alongside the dozens of other bound volumes. He walked back to his desk, took out a brand new blank leather book, and uncapped his fountain pen. Alistair opened his morning newspaper, turned to the local obituaries and city announcements, and smiled as his eyes landed on a photograph of a prominent young surgeon. "A fine name," Alistair whispered to the quiet room, blowing gently on the wet ink as he wrote the first letter onto the cover. "It will make a breathtaking addition to the gallery."